Education, and Nick Anden from King's College London. Thank you very much for your willingness to share your knowledge and experiences. Before we come to the main part of our webinar today, let us listen to remarks for our webinar today given by Ms. Santri Jahimo as the head of the laboratory of the Faculty of Teacher Training and Educational Sciences, Nusa Tenggara University. Ms. Santri, the screen is yours.
Hope my voice is loud and clear enough for you. Good afternoon all. Thank you to each and every one of you for being here with us today. On behalf of the organizing committee, I'm very pleased to be able to welcome all of you in our 2022 webinar series under the theme Current Issues in Teaching and Learning English. Although coronavirus is still around and we still have to conduct this series of events online, we're very positive that all the knowledge and experience shared by our invited experts are going to be as great as when they are held offline. Trust me, I know what I'm saying. Today we have three amazing presenters joining us from different places with different goals. Good morning to Dr. Nick Anden in London and Dr. Daniel Zeri in Malta. If I'm not mistaken, it's 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. in Malta, right? For your willingness and your morning time here with us to share your knowledge and experience related to ELT issues. Good afternoon to Dr. Lindsay Harron in Korea. Thank you for accepting our expertise in this event today, Dr. Harron. Well, I don't want to take much of the time as I know all of us are waiting to listen to the talks of our great speakers for today's webinar. I'd rather leave you now by wishing you all a great and productive session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Santri, for the opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, before we move to the presentation, I would like to remind all of us that the link for our attendance list today will be given once only, and it will be given after the closing remarks. For the participants who do not fill the attendance list, we are very sorry to tell you that you cannot get your certificate for this webinar. So please make sure that all of you can stay until the end of this webinar to be able to fill in the attendance list. Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, our presenters and participants, we will move to the main part of our webinar today, which is the presentation by our three amazing presenters. In order to do that, I would like to invite our
Thank you very much, Mr. Akif, for the presentation and this Dr. Nick and Dr. Daniel Zeri is the morning session. We are very glad that this thing now is for us to conclude. Before I give the floor to Dr. Anden, I would like to highlight that each speaker will be given 30-minute presentation, and after the presentation, there will be a 10-minute Q&A, which will be led by my fellow committee members. There will be three committee members who will lead the Q&A session. You will be the first, and Ismail will be the second, and there are 10 minutes for the last speaker. Okay, now we're moving to the biography of Dr. Nakanda. For some of you who have joined us in last year webinar, Dr. Anna is not new. He has
This is the second time we join our international webinar. Okay, let me move things to. Okay, I have real problem with my audio. So okay, then maybe the March can give me some teaching life beyond. I hope now I have been clear this week. Let me continue the background on the Dr. Miss Andon is working at the King College, London, but beforehand he has been working teaching English at foreign language center, also in Indonesia, and he was that if you want to say that since 1993 to 1999 we were the English language education at Science Valley University, where among others we were involved in teaching English academic courses, but in distance learning materials, it's teacher education and teacher development project. Dr. Andon joined King College in 1999. And we have several number of teacher education and materials different projects in Gabon, Tunisia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Mexico, Argentina, and Algeria. Dr. Andon's research is investigating the relationship between theory and research in second language acquisition and language knowledge to use and practices. Other research interests include the task-based language teaching, teacher development and materials in language teaching, learner autonomy and language learning, focus on the form within CBLC. The final PhD on language teaching methodology and materials, teacher reviews practices and AI, language teaching policy and curriculum, and language learning. Okay, that's the background that I can on behalf of the and however we make third international by excellence, that is clear. So and then I give the first to you.
Okay, that's better. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me? Yes, sir.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Better to do screen sharing from my side or from you?
It's all up to you, Dr. Andon, whatever you.
Okay. So I'll try to share my screen, and if that doesn't work, perhaps you can take over from there. Okay. I couldn't hear the introduction very well. I'm not sure that might be. Stan, do you want me to start now and give my presentation?
Yes, please. You have 40 minutes for your presentation.
Yeah. Sorry, how long?
40 minutes for your presentation.
Okay, great. So, okay. So I hope you can see my screen now. So, I know it's after. might have heard, we had a big storm yesterday, and a lot of houses were damaged, but it's a very sunny day. So today I want to talk task-based language teaching. This is an area I've been very interested in for years, and it was a subject of my PhD. Last year at the conference, I talked about the relationship between theory in applied linguistics and research in second language acquisition and language teaching. And today's talk builds on that a little bit. I want to review a couple of things from before and talk about how task-based language teaching fits with some of these theories and research in second language acquisition, perhaps fits better than previous approaches and methods to language teaching. Okay. If I'm going too fast or if something clear, please let me know. I mean, the first question is why should we be interested in language teaching? TBLT. It's one of many approaches in communicative language teaching that's been around for quite a long time. And task-based language teaching, I'd say, has also been around for 30 years, although it's gained a lot of popularity in the last 10 to 15 years. One reason for my interest in it is it's probably the approach to language that has been the most discussed and researched in recent years, and it has the support of many researchers and teacher educators, although not all teachers, not all researchers are in favour of task-based language teaching. And it's also an approach that's been picked up a lot by curriculum experts and by people who make policy in education. And I think it's certainly an approach that has at least the potential, the possibility to motivate learners and the possibility to be successful, where quite a lot of things we try in language learning classes are not so successful. So I think it has a lot of possibility and definitely worth considering in more detail. So today I hope to help you understand more clearly perhaps what's meant by task and also by task-based language teaching. I think those are two different things and different ways in which task-based language teaching has been put into practice in different contexts. I want to talk obviously about some of the key advantages and reasons or rationales for adopting this approach, but also some of the objections to task-based language learning and teaching. And think a little bit about how in the real world and materials designers try to integrate tasks and task-based learning with other approaches in the language learning curriculum. Okay. I'd like you to start by looking at what I think is a typical task. To me, this is a sort of fulfills all the criteria for a task. It's something that you might do with a group of intermediate learners. It's called the judgment task. And the main part of this task is that your learners, your students, are asked to imagine that they are judges, a panel of judges working in a group of 3 or 4 judges. And they have a number of cases to decide, and they have to make a decision. The decision is, what are you going to do with these different criminals or people accused of different crimes? And the way it would work would be that the students would get together in a group, read the information, they'd think about it, they'd discuss it, and then they'd make a decision. A decision might be something like, actually this person is not guilty, they should be allowed to go free, or this person could be sent to prison for 3 months because there are circumstances in their crime, or this person should be sent to prison for the rest of their life, and so on. So students would then work work on this for a number of minutes, probably 10 or 15 minutes, and after that time, they would be required to tell the teacher and the class what they've decided, tell the teacher and the class, and also to discuss it. So you might have one decision, but another group might come back and say, actually, we should send this man to prison for much longer time, and our reasons are this. And so a little bit of a debate can take part in the class after students have made their decision. Okay, so is that, yeah, that to me would be an example of a task. Students have some information, they discuss the information, and they make a decision, and then afterwards they present the decision back to the class. So what's the purpose of getting learners to do tasks like this? What kind of language and skills are being focused on in this task? What preparation and follow-up work would you expect a teacher to use for this task? Just have a think about that for 1 minute. It would be nice to have a discussion going, but it's not that kind of talk today. If you just think about that for a few seconds and think about perhaps who might do a task like this with your class, or whether as language learners yourselves, you remember doing activities like this in your lessons, and what the purpose was. I think answer the questions myself. I would really like to have heard your ideas on these, but we're a long way away. And clearly the first purpose of getting learners to do tasks like these is to get them to communicate. And so task-based language teaching is an approach where learners spend a lot of time actually communicating, and really communicating, because the aim of the task is for students to work together to reach a joint decision. So not just pretending to say sentences, they're actually using language to make a decision together. They need to that decision. It's very important that they do that. That's more important than practicing language to do a task. But obviously the real purpose is that you hope that they will learn something from it, that in communicating, through communicating, learners' language gets better. What kinds of language and skills are being focused on in this task? Actually, it's quite hard to say, but and you can set up a task exactly what students are going to say. And one for that is in a task-based approach, you don't provide students with lots of practice beforehand. You don't give them lots of language beforehand. I will talk later about how I would prepare students to do this task. But generally you could say, well, vocabulary, there's going to be a lot of vocabulary related to crime and punishment, like prisoner, accused, court, judge, sentence, prison sentence, guilty, not guilty, and so on. I think you can predict if learners are in groups to reach a joint decision, there's going to be a lot of language of discussion. So that would involve giving your opinion. I think, in my opinion, I feel that, giving reasons for your opinion, I agree, because in my opinion, he's not guilty, or I think she was justified in stabbing her husband, or something like that. And so language of giving your opinion, of agreeing and disagreeing, and giving reasons for your opinion and giving reasons for disagreeing. And almost all tasks that students do in groups need that language of discussion, agreement, reasons, and so on. What preparation and would you expect a teacher to use with this task? Well, I will talk a bit about it later, but I think what's perhaps most radical about task-based language teaching is that you wouldn't expect spend hours and hours giving students all which they might need to carry out this task. You wouldn't drill them, you wouldn't give them all the vocabulary you need to do. And because you don't prepare students with all the language they need and drill them and practice that language, they're going to make a lot of mistakes. And clearly, different students, different levels might be using language to do the same part. And some students will be using very complicated or correct or very fluent language, and other students might stumble through the task but still manage to get their meanings across. And if they can do, then that's successful. And interesting, the follow-up work would be the chance to work on language a lot more, as we'll see in the post-task phase. The teacher could say, "That's really good. You've made your decisions, and we agreed more or less how long these people should be going to prison for. Now let's do a bit of language practice. Now let's look at some of the language you were all using, that I heard you using during the task, and let's work on that so that next time we do a task, you'll be able to do the task a little bit better." So it's in some an unusual approach in that you ask students to communicate first, and then you perhaps teach them some of the language they needed to communicate afterwards. And we'll talk about the rationale for that later on. Okay. And this is really one of the big questions of language teaching, implicit and explicit learning, sometimes called formal learning and communicative learning. So one of the big questions that researchers have debated over the years is the question of whether language is acquired implicitly or just in a natural way by being exposed to the language and doing communicative activities. You could imagine that's a little bit like me when I moved to Indonesia in 1983. I didn't go to lessons at all. But I learned Indonesian by sitting in taxis, by going to shops, by buy things, by trying to communicate by needs, by trying to be friendly to people and chat to people I met. And gradually my Indonesian got better, gradually but rather slowly, I have to say, and not to a very great level. Or is it better to learn a language explicitly by understanding the rules of grammar, by having teachers explain things to you one bit of language at a time? You might think that about your own opinions on that. Clearly, as language learners, and I learned French and German at school, the dominant method was explicit language learning. We spent lots of time with the teacher explaining grammar rules to us. We spent lots of exercises and drills, and this was a long time ago. I was at school in the 1970s. We spent almost no time communicating at all. This acquisition researchers argue that language is mostly learned implicitly or subconsciously, but most teachers seem in favour of explicit teaching learning. Excuse me a second. I've recently had coronavirus, COVID-19, so my throat is still a little bit. So explicit learning, I showed this slide last time, is sometimes compared to a builder building a wall, and here you can see a not very good builder building a not very straight wall. But the idea of the analogy is that in explicit learning, the wall is built one brick at a time. So 1 week we might learn the present tense and some vocabulary related to everyday activities. And the next week we might start learning the present continuous tense. And the week after that we might learn about adjectives and so on. And this is my experience. After about 5 years, say, okay, now you've learnt all the bits, you have a complete wall, you can go out and start communicating with people. In this sequence, PPP, each week or lesson, the teacher presents a new piece of language. Students get a chance to practice it, and then perhaps at the end of the lesson, if there's time, you get a chance to communicate, talk about yourself. If you're learning the present tense, you might get to talk about your daily routine or about your hobbies and activities at the end of the lesson to your classmate. Very often in classes I've observed, there's a lot of and a lot of practice, but there often isn't enough time for, and so students don't get they've learned. Also, boring approach to language teaching, and it doesn't build up your confidence because you never get to practice actually communicating very much in the real world. And I remember after 7 years of speaking French at school, of learning French at school, I really wasn't able to speak it when I went to France. I had to learn, relearn using communicate by communicating with people when I moved to France. This is some in water, and it's sometimes called a deep end approach. Like taking, I'm going to learn, but I'm not. I'm just going to take you out into the. So this doesn't look very scared. But the idea is that in implicit learning, you will learn a language by focusing on grammar rules. In the language, communicate your needs and your desires and to talk about, and perhaps by writing as well. And perhaps my experience of moving to Indonesia and not understanding a word around me is a little bit deep-end approach, quite scary at first. And it takes a long time. I lived in Indonesia for 4 years, and I learned quite a lot, but I also realized that there is a lot I didn't learn, and particularly I didn't learn how to read and write in Indonesian. So language teaching is sometimes considered an implicit approach, but it has been argued that over hundreds of years, language teaching has shifted between basic explicit approaches and communicative-based approaches and back and so on. But certainly in my lifetime, perhaps there's been starting from much more grammar-based approaches and a movement towards more communication-based approaches. I think the reality is that teachers mix both. They spend some time on communication activities, and they spend some time on grammar-based or explicit teaching activities, and sometimes they've tried to find ways to integrate these. Moving on to the next slide. I'll just gloss over this kind of table that shows some of the difference between implicit and explicit learning. One difference is that very often you don't tell learners, today we're going to learn this. You might say, today we're going to do an interesting task about crimes and punishment, but you might not tell them we're practicing vocabulary related to this topic, and we're going to learn some new ways to take part in a discussion. You don't generally explain rules, and right from the start you encourage students to try to use language freely, whereas within an explicit approach you practice the language first, but you might later on in the lesson base language teaching fit into this? Well, I think it's seen mainly as a deep approach or an implicit approach where the main point is communicating. But it has been a Long, who's an American SLA researcher who's very famous, that task-based language teaching can combine the advantages of implicit communicative approaches and explicit grammar-focused approaches by providing the best opportunity on form. And as I mentioned before, the best time for doing that may be after done the task. Teacher has seen what they can do and what they can't do and build on that. So I'll come back to that idea of focus on form later. So very briefly, what is a task? I think this is a very simple and clear basic definition. Any activity that requires learners to use language with an emphasis on meaning in order to obtain an objective. So our task ask learners to work together to use language to think about meaning more than the words they were using, which is the objective. I really like this more complicated definition from Ellis and Tani because to describe a task, they provide 4 key characteristics. I know there are 5 there, I've added one. The main focus, learners are doing the task, they shouldn't be thinking too not making mistakes or about what grammar points they're using. They should mainly be thinking about how long are we going to send these people to prison. There needs to be some kind of gap, the need to convey information or express an opinion or to infer meaning, and in this case the gap is between the information we provided in the task about what these 4 people have done wrong and in a way the decision about what their punishment should be. But there's also a gap because different people in the class, different learners will have different opinions and experiences, and they'll be bringing those experiences to the class, and there'll be a need to communicate between them. So there's something to communicate. The answers are not obvious and different people will come. The third one I think is very controversial, that learners should largely rely on their own resources, their own language that they already have, rather than being given new use in the task, and also their own ideas, their non-linguistic resources. They shouldn't be told what to think, they should think for themselves. That is learners the language, although they might pick up some language from the little bits they were reading in the beginning. The fourth one is really important. There's a clearly defined outcome. In the case of that task we looked at, it was a decision, but it could be a choice or a plan for something to do, or it could be a solution to a problem, something like that. And when doing the task, learners should have that objective in mind, that outcome in mind, and focus on that. The last one, which comes from a separate definition from Ellis, involve real-world systems use. A bit like using language in the real world. I think I've had about 25 minutes or 15 minutes. There's another definition by Peter Skin, but I'll leave that. You'll be able to read the PowerPoint later. And so on. More definitions. Just one thing to point out from that, we often think tasks, activities, are all about speaking. But as Ellis pointed out, a task could be a listening task, a reading task, or a writing task, so that's what that's about. Here are some typical examples of tasks that involve a decision, or a plan, or a problem to be solved, or an issue, and so on. Just have spend a few minutes looking and think about perhaps what's the objective? What do students arrive at the end that they need to report back to their teacher and their class? So in the first one, students have to make a decision. They're the employer. They need to decide which one of their staff they unfortunately have to get rid of, and which one they can manage without. The second one involves making a plan, which is a nice idea, very common in task-based language teaching. The third one is solving a problem. The fourth one is like a role play in a way, and lots of role plays are not tasks, but if it's a role play where you have to make a choice between different interviewees and then say, we choose this one, then that role play has an outcome and a decision. And the fifth one is really a matching task. You have to make analysis, some information about different families and their needs, and you have to try to match them. That's also a very nice task. And I think you can contrast that activity, those activities, with something like this, where students are talking in pairs. They can see these pictures. There is a kind of something to talk about. Basically, it's just a drill. Students are saying to one another, "What's she doing?" And they point at the first picture, and the other student says, "She's water skiing." And the first student says, "Yeah, that's right." And the second picture, "What's he doing?" "He's cycling." So it looks quite communicative in a way, but nothing's being communicated because both students see the picture, there's no information gap, there's no purpose or outcome in these things. They're just practicing language. There's no communication taking place. It's a drill or a practice exercise. It involves displaying how well you can speak language, but it doesn't involve communicating. Very useful. It helps students become fluent, master this particular grammar point of present, but it doesn't help you to communicate. So what happens when teachers use tasks? Generally, we agree that actually there are three phases. In the pre-task phase, the teachers might provide learners with the materials they need to do the task, and perhaps the teacher might talk about the topic and what might be involved. She might relate the topic to students' own lives. They might talk about, in the case of crime and punishment, or if they ask about planning a holiday, they might ask students to talk about their best holiday or a recent holiday or what they're planning to do in the summer holidays coming up and so on. A key thing is the teacher should not really try to pre-teach the language or the grammar students might need to do the task, but she might choose to highlight some useful vocabulary that they might want to use in the task. But I think it should be clear that that's useful language, but they don't have to use it. They can use whatever language they want, and so on. One of the reasons for not trying to pre-teach the activity is that some learners may already know that language, and some learners may know other language they could use instead. The main phase is the task phase, where you give students a task, you make sure it's clear to them what they need to do, what the outcome is. It's clear to them that at the end of 10 minutes or 15 minutes, each group, or at least some of the groups, will be asked to stand up and explain to the whole class what they decided, and then there should be a chance for the whole class to respond to their ideas, agree, disagree, and so on. And clearly, while they are doing this activity, the idea is the teacher should be going around the class, listening in, helping students. But really, the main task of the teacher is to monitor and make a note of the language learners are using, make a note of any errors perhaps, but also to make a note of, oh, that was interesting, they're using some really interesting language there. So it's not just about errors, it's also about really good, useful language that the teacher notices some of the students are using maybe for the first time. Right, after the task, I think there are two things. The first thing is really that the teacher needs what learners focus on the outcome. What did they decide, or what did they plan? And that should be presented to the whole class and discussed it. and that's really worth spending time. It gives a purpose to the task phase. It wasn't just practice, it was actually an interesting activity, and we're interested in what the students thought and what they decided. Secondly is the language focus phase. At this point, the teacher can point out the errors, point out any useful language, and so on. This is called focus on form. And then after that, this might lead on to another task. For example, writing about a decision, or writing about the holiday you planned, or interviewing someone about the judgment or something like that, or just a completely new task, and so on. One thing you can do is, after you've done the form stage and fed in some useful language, is repeat the task perhaps the next week, or another similar task, and see if learners are doing better. The task repetition is an interesting thing. So this is the focus on form, the language stage. After the task, usually after the task, the teacher can provide an opportunity to think about language and to work on language point. It might simply be working on errors. The teacher could write the mistakes on the whiteboard and ask students to see if they can correct the errors. But the starting point could be some language that is not an error, some of the great things that learners have said. Also, the teacher can put something on the whiteboard and say, can anyone suggest some more ways to say the same thing? And this is often called extension, so you can think of more things. Focus on form after is reactive, and the good thing about that is need. You can say, oh, few people are having a problem with articles. Let's point out some of those. Clearly, the teacher can't work on all the language, all the errors she's noticed, so she'll try to pick out things people have had problems with. She's trying to pick out things that learners are ready to, can include some drills and practice activities, but not spend a long time on them. And the aim is just to point things to students, make students aware that there's a gap between what they said and what a native speaker or a more advanced speaker might say. But then it's not expected that they will master this and they'll know it. Okay. Can someone tell me how much time I've got left? I think it's about 5 or 10 minutes.
Yes, I have 10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay, 10 minutes, I'll probably finish in a little bit less than that. Okay. I think this approach, first of all, is justified and fit very well with something I talked about last year, principles for instructed second language learning. These are a set of principles by Ellis, where he says that these are the key conditions we need to create in order for people to learn. And this is from Rod Ellis. He's been talking about these since about 2008, and he's really the most well-known and most active recipient of acquisition. Based on all his reading in second language acquisition, he came up with these principles. I've reordered them a little bit, but these are really the key ones. That predominantly there needs to be a focus on meaning. Most of the time in lessons needs to be learners trying to communicate meanings. But very importantly, there also does need to be opportunity to focus on form, to focus on grammar, vocabulary, expression, and so on. And the third one is about input, in other words, listening to language and reading language. Learners need a rich and meaningful exposure to language in use, so real language, authentic language, that's actually being used to communicate something and not just being read to answer questions or something like that. The fourth one is about output, in other words, learners speaking and writing in the classroom. They need opportunities for purposeful communication in the L2. So learners need to be able to communicate meanings, to speak and to write, in order to communicate with other people in the classroom. And So both 3 and 4, when students are listening and reading and speaking and writing, it's still important. Number 1 is important. When they're doing so, they should be focusing on communicating meanings. Number 5 means that the best way to learn is when 2 or more learners are speaking together, interacting together, trying to communicate their meanings with one another, exchanging the roles of speaker and listener. And the 6th one is about motivation. Learners need to be affectively and cognitively engaged. They need to be engaged with their emotions, so they need to be interested, maybe made happy or angry by the topics, so they need to be made to use their brains to really think. So the example of the judgment task means actually you have to think quite hard about these cases and think about, what do I feel, you know? And if they feel the task is worth doing, I think they'll do it better and so on. Jane Willis, who's a teacher educator who's written a lot about task-based language teaching, points out that there are these 4 key conditions to language learning, and it's similar to what the previous slide says. Learners to be exposed to real language, produce language themselves, to do things, to exchange meanings. They need to be motivated. If learners are motivated, they'll pick up the language and try. And the 4th thing is really about focus on form. They also need some opportunity to focus on form and to have explanations from the teachers and do practice activities. When I reflect back on my school days, there was not really much exposure to real language. We didn't read much except made-up stories. We certainly didn't get much chance to speak and communicate in the classroom. We just did lots of writing, sentences, and maybe we would speak sentences, but we wouldn't communicate. We would never talk about our own ideas. Motivation, there wasn't much. It wasn't very exciting. We were motivated by the teacher, who would get very angry if you made mistakes, but it wasn't a very joyful process. Instruction, by which Willis means not just the teacher giving explanations, but also students doing exercises and practice drills, that's all we did a lot of the time. And it kind of worked for me. It didn't work, but it's very slow and boring. Okay. There are a number of rationales for getting learners to do using a task. It helps them language, it helps them to practice really spontaneous interaction. They can notice how their classmates and their teacher express things. They practice things like turn-taking, they're using language purposefully. They're not just producing sentences, which was all I did at school, but they're actually having discussions and debates and making presentations. They can try out communication strategies, and they develop confidence. There are other sets of rationales related to second language acquisition. Carrying out tasks is considered to trigger second acquisition. And the reason for this is that it's believed that second language acquisition is triggered by communication. And so the idea is that learners will pick up new language and start to acquire new language from taking part in tasks, language that nobody's taught them. They almost fluent in language And the other thing is that different learners in a class will all be at different levels, but they can all learn what they're ready next. So they're not all learning the same thing, but hopefully they're all learning something useful. I think there are some other practical advantages to really like using language in the real world, and so it helps students to prepare for actually transferring what they've learned in the classroom outside to the world outside. Secondly, if learners are learning English or another language to be doctors or to be engineers or to be pharmacists or to be travel agents, you can design tasks that are related to their jobs, their careers and so on. I already mentioned that tasks can help efficiency, they can promote should develop confidence. One thing a lot of teachers say to me is tasks provide enjoyment. They use them on a Friday afternoon when students are tired. They're a bit different from the other class, and so they can be very... Last one's really important. If you get learners to do tasks as a teacher and listen to what they're saying, you can kind of think, oh, they know that already. I was planning to teach that next week, but I can see everyone can do... Oh, I thought they knew about... Still having problems. I think focus a bit on that next week. So tasks can be a really good diagnostic tool for teachers and help them to see what learners already know and what they can't do, and you can plan next week's lessons based on that. There are nevertheless problems with tasks, and these are there's a lack of evidence that a pure task approach would work. I don't think anyone has really tried it. It's different from what I experienced at school, and I find it difficult to implement because they have no experience of learning like this as learners. Not the way school, it's going to be difficult for you to teach in this way. Teachers have a lot of difficulty understanding what TBLT is about and what is a task and what's not a task. And this idea a task must have a real outcome and real communication needs to be taking place in the classroom is quite difficult for teachers sometimes. There aren't good books of task-based materials for teachers to use. Different people understand the approach in different ways. People worry that actually learners will just use their L1 or they'll just use very simple language, or they'll never pick up new language, they'll just use the language they already know. The answer to that may be that focus on form stage at the post-task stage is a good chance to really push students to use more adventurous language. People worry that there may be noisy classrooms, or they might be difficult to control the discipline in the class, or that learners not be doing the task and so on. Actually, it may also be quite a difficult skill for teachers, particularly if you have to, immediately after the task, you have to explain some grammar points to the learners without preparation and so on. And testing tasks, we're going to move on to a couple of things. I think this is a useful checklist, but you can see it on the PowerPoint later. I think this is another useful thing, but I'd just like to point out the task, which is quite difficult for teachers. They have a lot to do. They need to provide feedback, they need to incorporate focus on ample input. They might need to model or practice the performance of the task beforehand. And teachers need to decide which language, out of all the language students are using, are we going to focus on. It is possible to combine task-based language teaching with more traditional teaching, and there are different ways to do this. I think one way to do it would be to focus maybe on interesting tasks, but to language at different times. And another way, I think, to perhaps spend some lessons every week doing tasks and communicating. But to be on the safe side, and also to the fact different learners in different ways, it might be a good idea to do some grammar-based lessons and some task-based lessons, but not necessarily to try to tie those together in any way. Okay, I'm going to finish there. I think I've said really the main things I want to say, and you can read the PowerPoint, which will be made available to you. But I'd just like to point out, as a final slide, the task was a second language acquisition. They really are responsibility and effort to the learners. I've seen some fantastic teachers running the classroom, explaining things, trying to get learners to respond, and learners are there on their desks, half asleep, actually, learners are the ones who need to be working hard in lessons, and teachers should prepare the lesson and give it to learners and really be a bit relaxed, otherwise we will get over. Key thing, it allows for differentiation. Different learners can learn at different paces, and everyone can learn what they need to learn. I think provides providing a sense of achievement. Pupils can see if they're able to communicate and get their messages across to others, and it provides of learning what learners can do. Okay, I'll end there, and yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, sir. Am I audible? Yes.
Yes?
All right. Good afternoon. Should I say selamat sore, Doctor?
Selamat sore.
Yeah, good. My name is Rizky and lead the question and answer segment. I have with me several questions. I have compiled several questions, and please allow me to share the screen.
So I need to stop screen sharing.
Yes. I hope my screen is available. You all to see. So the first question comes from Ms. Santri Jahimo. Nick, when and in what forms do feedbacks take place, and when using
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question, Sanjay. I hope I've sort of predicted it to some extent by saying, generally, Mike Long is very clear. He says it should be after the task, and it should be reactive, by which he means is wait and see what learners can do and cannot do in the task, and then provide some feedback after the task. Rod Ellis, who's another great researcher, he says actually you can try and predict what problem students are going to have and give sort of pre-feedback before the task. What forms should feedback take place? I think this is difficult because it's difficult for teachers to plan it on the spot, and I think it's legitimate for a teacher to note down errors and say, actually, I'm going to think about some of these and do them next week instead. I'm going to plan my feedback. But it's quite good to do some quick feedback, and I think a quick way to do it is just have some notes made as you go around the classroom as a teacher and just write them up on the whiteboard. Maybe even, while students are doing the task, just write a few things on the whiteboard. And after students have done the task, after you've done some feedback on the outcome, on the ideas, that's really important. I've seen times teachers say, okay, well done, you've done the task, I listened to you, now I'm going to correct your errors. I think that's a real shame. Students need to hear what other groups have done. And after that, that's a good time for feedback. But maybe next week is also a good time for feedback. And just a simple thing, board, discussing with learners, seeing if they know the answers. That's a really important thing, Santri. I'd say feedback is supposed to just point something out. Point out. Don't necessarily to remember it. After you've pointed things out 2 or 3 times, some of them will start to remember them, and you'll see some of them start to use them. You can do a little bit of practice. I mean, I would go in and write a little exercise for learners and hand it out to them. And not expecting learners to say, I'd just like to point this out. It's quite good to say to learners, get in the habit of writing down what we write on the board. Go home and study it on your own. I hope that answers your question, Sandri.
Thank you so much, sir. And the second question is from is this. it possible to unveil activities within? Sorry.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Will Ricardo about it?
While Ricardo, it's for us to jump to the next question. Is it okay, Dr. Andrew? Sure. The next question is, sorry, Coach TBLC is going to be successful in doing a group task? Because in fact, most of some students are not actively engaged in group. So what's the best way for the teacher to justify that all students have come to reach the from Charles Zacharias and Dr. Andy Nicholson?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that question, Charles. I know that's a concern lots of teachers have. And I talked about this when I by Dr. Pauline Foster, and I can see that there were always learners who weren't actively participating in the class, and they sat at the they weren't participating. And so I don't think it's a problem that's particularly related to task-based language teaching. And funnily enough, I think it's a problem that task-based teaching can address. First of all, learners are doing a task. They're the ones who are busy, and the teacher now has some free time to go around the room and try to and at least make them aware that you're not trying. Secondly, you're giving learners a task to do. You're saying, you've got a job to do, responsibility, you need to do this task. And at the end of 10 minutes, I'm going to pick up your group and right, can you tell me what you've done? And if they've done nothing, that hopefully they're going to be embarrassed. They haven't done the task. If they've done the task in Bahasa Indonesia in English, they're going to struggle to express their ideas in English. And I think that puts some pressure on them to try a bit harder next time. One other thing to add is, we need to explain to learners why they're doing it. Why are we doing tasks and not just getting you to sit down to listen to me, the boring old teacher, explain stuff? And if you can explain some of these principles, I think I would use that very nice diagram from Jane Willis to say, these are the 4 things you need to learn a language: exposure, opportunities to use language, motivation, and instruction. I'm the teacher, I could do the instruction, but most of the time you've got to be reading, listening, exposed to speaking and writing, using language productively. We need to explain to teachers, as teachers, we need to explain to students what our principles are and why we do things. I think to say to them, behind at the back, we do tasks, you can do nothing, but you're not going to learn anything, and it's not my... It's a very good question, and I know my answer is simplistic. It's a real struggle, but it's an important thing to work on. Andy, this is a question too. How to get group to participate. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. Since we haven't heard from more elaborations of explanations from the previous questions, we will proceed to the next questions. The question is, does each group member participate by giving their opinion? If it is represented by one person to give the opinion of all group members, then can it be ensured this get learning progress by using TBLT method? Thank you, sir.
Another really good question. And this is really the skill of teachers, and teachers going around the class will notice this. Not in one lesson, over time you notice, oh, that class, I wonder why. And you know as teachers that this is a really difficult problem, and you know as teachers that you have techniques to deal with it. You know, I'm sure you've all tried different things. One is to say, have to somebody to take somebody to be a kind of chairperson, somebody who's going to be the spokesperson who presents your answers back to the class later, and the fourth person has another job. And you can also say, you know, each lesson we're going to rotate these roles so everyone gets a chance to do them. As you know, you can by putting them together, a mixed group in each group to say, okay, today you're the chairperson, but you're also the teacher of this group, and your job is to make sure you get opinions from all the others and they're all and so on. By the way, between doing the task and presenting the task back to teachers, between doing the task and presenting your ideas back to the whole class, Jane Willis recommends that the group sits down and spends a few minutes planning presentation. So they work together to plan exactly what they're going to say to the class. And in that, they're really focusing on language accuracy. But yeah, difficult problem, but we know there are ways to attack that. No easy answers, but we need to get everyone participating. Yeah.
Sure, the answer was very enlightening for us, and that is all session for question and answer. And you to also give your closing remarks, and you may proceed with the closing remarks, Doctor.
Okay, so I would say thank you very much for listening. After all, and I would say try to use more tasks in the classroom, but try to use them in a structured way. Task-based teaching is not easy in careful planning, but I think for a lot of students it's very, very rewarding.
Is that it, sir?
Thing I'd like to say today.
Thank you much, sir. And Debbie, I would like to invite Dr. Daniel Terry slide on the screen with us. Dr. Daniel Terry, we might proceed to the second segment from Dr. Daniel Terry. Dr. Daniel Terry is going to talk about supporting teacher researchers, development of research literacy. A little background from Dr. Daniel Seri is that he teaches at the Center for English Language Proficiency, CELP, CELPs, and CETSOL, running study unit, second language acquisition, CETSOL fieldwork, and the development and assessment of English language proficiency. Daniel is the author of more than, he has published review papers in international academic journals, chapters in books edited by world-renowned academics, and articles in international journals, and magazine. As the basis for some publications, he has interviewed writers and educators in Australia, the UK, and the USA. Dr. Daniel Sherry, you may proceed with the presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you also for me to contribute to this interesting event. It's be on how we can equip teachers, language teachers, with the knowledge and skills and attitudes in order for them to be able to engage with and in research. This is based on a series of interviews that I conducted with educators, trainers, teacher trainers, and individuals in different parts of the world, as well as articles that I edited for a journal published by a teachers association here in Europe. And what I'm going to be saying is ultimately about the idea that if teachers are interested in using research as part of their professional development, it's ultimately based on an individual teacher's will, then they might require support for them to enhance their research literacy. And I'm going to be looking at what various teacher educators, teachers, and academics have said about how this support can be provided. The first question that I'd like to pose to you, however, before we start, is what is your relationship with research? And I'd like you to think a bit about it as educators and to consider why research might or might not be part of your professional career as an educator. Feel free to suggest your answer to the question in the chat box, and we'll have some time to going through some of the comments. It could be something that we can discuss later in the Q&A. Whether teachers have such a one of is the element of skepticism that we come across in the work of prominent individuals in ELT, who feel that perhaps teachers should focus primarily on language teaching and they should concern themselves with research. They shouldn't be doing research. They shouldn't even be engaging with research because research is not the part of what the role, the duties entail. People like Meili, for example, talk about how research, teacher research, isn't something that should be given. Someone like Peter Medges, teachers shouldn't jump on the bandwagon of research. They should primarily concern themselves with other ways of enhancing their knowledge, and he refers to intuition, for example, and experience. However, in the rest of this talk, I'm going to be focused on a very different perspective, a perspective which underscores the value research for those educators who feel that it is an important way of professional development. And this is linked to an idea that a colleague of mine based in Greece, Achilleas Kostoulas, talks about in an article that I edited for a book that I'll read with you. He talks about how when we don't research, and I'll talk about the difference between those two prepositions at a later stage, then what is that we might the fossilization of the profession. That is, the practices that we're used to as language teachers, they keep perpetuating themselves infinitely without ever questioned, without ever being challenged, and hence without ever being visited and potentially changed. So, research is important for effective teaching. We do as language teachers isn't relying merely on intuition and experience, but it is also relying on the evidence that we engage in with talk online or at a conference, or when we read an article, either published by an academic or else by a teacher who has conducted some research in their own classroom. So, research here in this particular talk is being as something valuable and also as something accessible and inclusive, not exclusive. It is not something that is the domain of academics, of people working at universities like myself, but it is something that is also people working in language classrooms all over the world. And that is the argument that I'm going to try and push in this particular talk. But for us to do this, we need to start with a very basic question. A question that might seem quite simplistic, but in reality is one of the first hurdles that encounter think about research. And conceptions of research might actually help to make research seem distant from the work and the concerns of teachers on a daily and weekly basis. And the question is, what is research? What ultimately is this activity, this phenomenon that we are saying should be part? As you're aware, different individuals, based on their background and based on their interest, provide somewhat different interpretations of the term. However, at the academic tradition, we see that definitions have ultimately gained more power than others. And these definitions were the definitions that ultimately were embraced only academics, but also teachers. What we end up is the fear of research itself as an activity, and perhaps feelings of not knowing how to do research, not feeling as if we are entitled to research or to engage with research. Question to Christine Kuhn, who is a teacher educator based me that for her, research is an activity that enables her to find things out, to learn, interested in your classroom, something that you witness, an event, then might concern your own practices or those of your students is pose a question and to try and find an answer to that question. And think of it, yes, research, finding answers to the questions that we have. And we, all of us, each individual, has plenty of questions about what happens in the classroom, which to the people outside of the classroom might seem like a black box. But sometimes to us, what is happening in the classroom might also be a source of puzzles. We're puzzled what we witness happening, and sometimes we know why it might be happening, what could actually be happening, and how things might change. So research is the means by which we find answers to those questions. Similarly, another person that I interviewed, Kathleen Graves, talks about how when we move away from narrow definitions of research, and we see democratic as something belonging to everyone, to all language educators, then we start to see that research is available to everybody. And available to everybody, obviously, we are not implying that you could just go about this activity without any form of support. No. What we're saying here is that if you're interested in finding answers to your questions, then you might require support. And that support could come your ways and from different people. And we'll talk about that when we focus on the issue of research literacy. So earlier, I kept these two prepositions, with and in. And it's important to think of research engagement in these two ways. When we engage with, we're basically reading published research, and as I mentioned, needn't just be the research we find in academic journals, scholarly journals, but it will also be research published by teachers in other kinds of publications, whether they are magazines, journals published by teacher associations, websites, whatever it may be. So the engagement with research when we listen to people talking about research. The engagement research is when we do research in our context. People emphasize the importance of other individuals talk about how we shouldn't stress the issue of systematicity all that much, as long as a teacher arrives at answers to the questions. So there are also different perspectives on how teachers may engage research, and we'll see that. The other point that I already made is that when we engage in research and when we engage with published research, is contribute to, and this is the point that Cordingley makes in a number of articles that she has published on professional learning. Professional learning almost being a step further than professional development. Professional learning being something that you're fully responsible to, without needing anyone to tell you that you need to do it. You're fully in charge of it and you're in control of the process. But it's not good enough to say that everyone can do research and that everyone should be entitled to do research. We also need to consider some of the involved in ultimately becoming a research-engaged language teaching professional. And there are various challenges, and some of those challenges have to do with the knowledge and skills that you need to develop in order for you to become a research-engaged professional. And though there are forms of support can be provided with in order for them to ultimately position as research-engaged professionals. So let us start by considering some of these challenges. One of them, as I already hinted at the beginning of this talk, consists of how teachers, or some teachers, define research, their understanding of research. And this is a point that Dudley Reynolds made when I spoke to him about the issue of teacher research. When we embrace certain narrow definitions of research, research with a capital letter, research that is associated with certain practices that academics have been trained to do, then yes, this might end up just feel that research can never be part of the professional life because of the expectations associated with that narrow definition. Hence, the first challenge that teachers may encounter when they're interested in becoming research engaged professionals is the conceptualization of research. If the definition of research is way too narrow, is only associated with university academics, then they are obviously going to feel that this is not part of what they can do. And that is a major problem. So the first point is that in order for us to overcome this challenge, we need to broaden of research and to embrace teachers as part of the activity, to see research as something that is also available to teachers and accessible to them. The other point is linked to the issue of how we is something that can of teachers' professional identity. Research is not something that is only part of an academic's identity, but in fact, as an activity, it is something that can be part of the way they see themselves as professionals. And that's why my title, the title for this talk, uses the term teacher researcher with a hyphen. Because here we're saying that when research is embraced as part of your identity, then as a teacher researcher. And both roles are important to how to see your professional identity, to how you of your professional identity. And Kathleen Graves makes this point when talking about the value of actually enabling teachers to start seeing as part of the professional duties, the professional learning, and as a way for them to find answers to the questions that they might have about language. Also talks about the problems associated with the discourse that traditionally has associated research only with academia. It has led to the creation of misconceptions that have ultimately ended up in teachers' brains, about what is right and wrong research, what is good, bad research, what is valid and invalid. And these are misconceptions that act as challenges because they might help to distance teachers from research as an activity. And in fact, Hanks, a teacher educator based in the UK, talks about how what's missing most often when we and research and the relationship between the two is trust. Lack of trust. It's as if teachers are not to be, they are not trusted to be able to understand research, where to position themselves as research engaged professionals. And that lack of trust is a major obstacle because not trusted as a professional, not trusted in your capacity to to the next sufficient in teachers' ability to engage and do research. Are they to do research? And according to Renanda and Flores, yes, most teachers research power statement It is a statement that challenges the idea that teachers are incapable of doing research. 4, according to this modern definition, yes, teachers, in carrying out the activities that they do in the classroom on a weekly basis, they are engaged in research. They are on. There is research happening there. They might not end up publishing the result. The research to, but people like Willy Renandia and even Judith Hanks talk about how many of the activities that we engage are similar to some of the activities that we do when we engage in research. With deciding and talks about how it is fallacious to say and to think that teachers are uninterested in questions. In his opinion, and in his experience working with teachers, primarily in the Gulf region and the US, teachers want to know answers. Individuals, they are curious professionals, they might not always know how to answer seeking answers to that they have the capacity for research. And Thomas Farrell, who is associated with talks about how even when teachers position themselves as reflective practitioners and when they are using reflection as a means to ultimately improve their own practices as educators, especially if that reflection is based on evidence that they might have collected. This is an approach to doing research as well. It is also highly systematic. You're using a specific model of reflective practice. This leads us to the question, what is research literacy? So, the teacher researching that support could be very leads us to find the notion of research literacy, which has become more and more popular over the past years. So, according to Kostulas, I started. Research literacy is about where research is found. So, for example, knowing where research is commonly disseminated, whether it's in journals, magazines, websites, events, webinars, okay? Then knowing how to appraise it, to determine how valuable it is to one's needs as an educator, and ultimately how to one's. So that is important. But this component of research has to do with engagement with research rather than engagement in research. And as what is also necessary as part of this definition of research literacy are these broad conceptions of which we talked about. Broadening the concept of research, broadening the understanding of what research consists of, in order for people to see what teachers are capable of doing, of conducting research. Significant. And research most often is linked to knowledge and skills. Knowledge and skills, technical aspects of doing research. skills, we wouldn't be doing enough. We wouldn't be equipping teachers with everything they require in order for them to successfully engage in research. Hence, what is also important are those broad research, providing teachers with the confidence, developing their confidence as professionals who are capable of becoming engaged. Without that confidence, it is highly teachers will go on to try and use research to find answers to questions. But why should all of this? Why is this important? Why is it ultimately something that teachers should be thinking about, that teacher educators should be giving value to? Quite recently, I finished writing a book for the British Council on what the role educators can play in enabling teachers to be research engaged professionals. And one of the ideas is that we need to ultimately care about this issue. There could be thousands of teachers out there who don't as an important part of the national identity. And one of the reasons for that might be, as I've already mentioned, due to an entrenched conception about what research is and whom research belongs to, doesn't belong to. So, Graves talks about how when teachers have been given the knowledge, skills, confidence, and all of the attributes that they require in order for them to do research, then they are in a position to generate knowledge for themselves. They are experts that come into the school or come into the country sometimes and tell them what they need to be doing, what the answers to their questions are. No, when teachers with the competence to actually become finding out require the expertise of in certain cases, but needing it we're not together, but knowledge as a is very important to engage with the knowledge generated by academics. For Donald Freeman, it is a process of making your own assumptions about the things that you do on a weekly basis in the classroom. It is a means by which you can discover new ways of interpreting the classroom context and classroom of a full way in which you can change your about language teaching, language learning. For David Noonan, who also contributed one of the chapters to the book that I'm going to be sharing with you at the end, for David Noonan, research is a means by which we discover what's happening in the classroom. It's also a means by which we can solve problems or find solutions to the puzzles that we have. One, have given of importance to teachers' ability in action research. Action research being a systematic approach which discover solutions to some of the you experience as a language educator. Also, and more importantly, a means which we can have outcomes for our language learner. For Dario Banegas, an educator from Argentina, research is empowering. It empowers because they are to become knowledge constructors, but also the knowledge that they create is ultimately it's created by one who doesn't fully understand the context in which that teacher actually is. And Kostulas says something similar when he talks about pedagogical knowledge that is possible as a result of classroom-based research, but here we're talking about classroom-based research conducted by teachers and not by academics. Knowledge has value for the teacher because it is teaching, and it also can. Noonan has said as well. Quran, an debate in Pakistan, and man happen. The results of the research are going to be responding to the needs of the content, the classroom. And they are practice-based needs. They are needs that have to do with what they do as educators and with what activity as part of their lessons. So it is research that is ultimately sensitive to the needs of the people, and those people are the students and the teacher. Other individuals, researchers, have talked about how this idea can be involving students in the process. So we look at the work of Anna Maria Pinter and her work in India. We see how themselves, language learners, can be seen as co-researchers. So the teacher and the students are collaborating on finding the answers to the questions that they might have about language learning and teaching. And for Richard Smith, all of this is important because it is teacher-initiated research. It is research conducted by teachers for from this as well as the learners, and he sees this as being potentially subversive. And it is subversive because of what I said earlier. We are no longer relying exclusively on knowledge provided to us by the academic experts, by the course book writers, by the major publishers. We are also relying on the knowledge that we are able to generate as language educators. So that is why it is potentially subversive, because we are no longer acting passively, but we are actively generating knowledge that is relevant to our needs and to the needs of our learners. As to the question of support. So what kind of support? If we're convinced that teachers are capable of doing it, if we're convinced what do they require in order for them to do it effectively? Major issues mentioned by many people that I spoke to is time. Many teachers feel that they don't have the time to do with research because their time is taken up by teaching, and there's no time at all for other kinds of activities. One way of rethinking this notion of not time is to do what Judith Hanks says, starting to see research being very similar or overlapping with our concerns with finding answers to our questions by means of the very activities that we do in class, then suddenly see that we do have time for research. The other challenge is obviously certain entrenched beliefs have about research. especially if we see research that belongs to academics. It belongs to the people who were the ivory towers of academia. If that's the case, then those beliefs need to be changed, they need to be developed in order for us to be able to embrace the broad conceptions of research that I was talking about. And the other thing that teachers might require is technical competence. So they might require support in order for them to develop the knowledge and skills required to collect data, analyze data, make sense of data, interpret data. So important. However, it would be mistaken to focus on as the only form of support that teachers require when it comes to research literacy. The support could come in a variety of different ways. There needs to be institutional. So if an institution sees its teachers as only concerned with language teaching and it defines their duties in a very narrow manner, then that is problematic for teachers who might want to ultimately conduct research in their classroom, who might want to use research as a means of learning more about what happens in the classroom. The support also could come in the form of collaboration from one's teacher or one's students. So when we talk of research, it needn't be something that we're doing entirely on our own. It could be done in collaboration with one's peers, with one's students. And for Simon Borch, when there are key conditions that are missing from the process, then it is highly likely that teacher research is not going to be effective. Or it might also be that if teachers are not provided with the support that they require, then there is the likelihood that research is going to be a negative experience. And if it's going to be a negative experience, they're going to feel even more detached from research as activity. Support needs to be there, it needs to be varied, and it needs to be good support. Otherwise, teachers are not going to feel empowered enough to ultimately want to do research in their context. For Hanks, support is also a broad idea. Respecting teachers as people who have the potential to do research, encouraging them to actually do so, providing them with the autonomy to find answers to questions, and empower them to research that is meaningful for them, that isn't just meaningful for the people who might be supporting them, especially what is coming from an academic. And you've probably heard of relationships between academics and teachers who work to learn what the research question is in such projects. Is it only the academic who's doing so, or is the teacher actually working with the academic in order to find answers to questions? And teachers need to ultimately be ordered to start seeing research as something that can be into their existing practices, that is part of the have as language teachers an addition, not a supplement. It can be an intrinsic part of. Another form of support can be provided by teacher associations, and those of you who belong to national, regional, or even international teacher associations, you might be aware of groups within these associations that enable teachers to and learn more about research, the necessary research literacy in order research engaged professionals. Teacher associations can, Thomas Farrell, help to develop that sense of responsibility that all teachers have, all good teachers, sense of responsibility, and they're curious in the puzzles. They all have issues that they might try to resolve, and has a teacher association to help them find solutions, find answers, find ways of developing knowledge by means of formal support. And that formal support could come from who speak to the members of it could come via projects that enable teachers to conduct research in classrooms. And if we look at the work of the IATEFL research group, there are many examples of this from teachers from all over the world. However, for Thomas Farrell, it's very important that research, ultimately teachers engage in, it needs to be something that is valuable to the individual who is doing it. It is not something imposed on the teacher from the outside, but it needs to come from the teacher herself. You yourself, if you're interested in positioning yourselves as research engaged professionals, how can you get support? What kind of support is available to you out there? And yes, there are mentors. Your mentors could be peers, your peers in the school, people who might have some experience of research, either because they've done a postgraduate degree or else because some training. Those peers who might have experience of doing research can help you with your own mini research project. You could also turn to academics, and there are many academics highly generous with their time, and they're interested in helping teachers to ultimately do research in the classroom. And not only that, they are, in certain cases, interested in helping to disseminate the results of that research. And your students, as I already mentioned, and if you're interested in this, I would encourage you to look at the work of Anna Maria Pinter, especially a study that she did for the British Council, and look handbook that is Rama Mathel from India, on how teachers and students can work as co-researchers. And by students, we're not only referring to university students, we're referring to students who are much younger than that. Teachers provide support, or if they don't, you could put pressure on them to start providing support, especially if you're a member of a teacher association, putting pressure on your teacher association